By now, most of us are used to the left's attempts to cancel anyone on the right. But now, the media and the NDP are being held to account for their bad faith tactics. When the court awarded legal costs to one woman who was viciously smeared back in 2019, Caylan Ford is taking her fight for justice all the way to the top. She'll be joining us today to discuss. I'm Rachel Parker, and you're watching The Rachel Parker Show. Hey everyone, I'm Rachel Parker. Welcome back to The Rachel Parker Show. We are joined today by Caylan Ford. Caylan Ford was a candidate for the United Conservative Party back in 2019, but she decided to step down, saying that her candidacy became a distraction from the party after private messages with someone she considered a friend at the time were leaked. The messages were very brief and taken out of context, and the Alberta NDP, as well as many in the mainstream media, began to viciously shame Caylan Ford as a racist. Caylan Ford is certainly not a racist, and she has been pushing for justice in the years since. I'm so impressed with how long she's continued this fight, as legal battles are very costly and stressful. Now, the court, as I mentioned, has awarded her $22,000 in legal costs, saying that the Alberta NDP and the federal NDP will have to pay Caylan Ford in her fight for justice. Caylan, thank you so much for being here today. Why don't you just start by explaining this $22,000 in legal costs that you were awarded? What was the court's rationale for providing you this allotment?
Thanks, Rachel. And to be clear, this is just costs on an interlocutory decision. So the real deal is going to be probably a month and a half long trial, most likely in early 2026. We'll get a trial date actually later this month. So this was just on a decision that came about in the process of moving to trial. And the issue here was that the Alberta NDP had participated in defamation against me in 2019. I was running against their then Minister of Justice in a very competitive seat. And a month before the election, we can rehash all that if you want. I think probably a lot of your viewers are familiar with the sort of broad lineaments of the story. But basically, they sort of claimed that I was racist, hateful, and by implication, morally unfit to stand for office and had to be removed from the ballot. And so I wanted to name them in my defamation claim. They're one of 14 or 15 parties that I named. But I encountered a problem, which is that the Alberta NDP doesn't actually exist. So even when it was the governing party of Alberta, it had no legal personality. It could not sue or be sued. It was not incorporated as a society or as a not-for-profit company or anything else. And so we did some research, my lawyer and I, and we tried to figure out, well, under what auspices were they even registered as a political party? How do they open bank accounts? How do they enter into contracts? And we found, with the help of Elections Alberta, that they registered in 1977 pursuant to a trust deed where the trustee was the Alberta New Democratic Party Foundation. So he thought, aha, we can sue the trustee. But we couldn't, because the Alberta New Democratic Party Foundation also is non-existent, doesn't exist. So we had no one to sue. But then we looked at the Alberta NDP's constitution, in which it says that it is established as a section of the federal NDP. And the federal NDP does have an incorporated association that can be sued. And the federal party's constitution likewise sort of it acknowledges this kind of reciprocal relationship where it is supreme ultimately over the provincial parties. So we sued the federal party. And the federal party didn't like that. They said, we have nothing to do with the provincial sections. They operate autonomously. It's not our problem. And so they filed for summary dismissal. And this became a very protracted, extremely convoluted matter right before we went before a judge to hear this application for summary dismissal. And on our side, we had asked if the court would be willing to provide us some direction as to who is the liable party that we can name. Hours before we go before the judge, the Alberta NDP, or their sort of yeah, I suppose their lawyer, even though they're a non-party, they said, "Look, we can come to a solution. We will name and indemnify an individual to stand on our behalf." So we would go before the judge and we're like, "You know what? If we can do that, that would be fine with us. We don't care who we sue as long as we have someone to sue and they're properly indemnified." And so on that basis, the judge said, "All right, that sounds good. In that case, you're discontinuing against the federal party and I owe them costs." The federal party claimed that they had spent over $90,000 to that point to attend, a 1-hour hearing and a 12-minute questioning and to put together one 12-page brief. So which is a massive, I think, massive inflation of their legal costs. And they stuck that with me with that. And I think my suspicion, not proven, just based on the circumstantial evidence, is they were trying to prejudice me against continuing the litigation because obviously I couldn't afford that. The defamation had rendered me jobless and I was already struggling financially. So, uh, and then the Alberta party never named that representative and they didn't respond to us when we tried to look for that person's name for many months. And so finally, we went before a judge again and appealed this and said, "Look, we still don't have a party to name." They reneged on their agreement that they made before the applications judge. And also, this cost award against me is not reasonable, right? That's not justifiable based on the case law that we have. So that judge overturned everything and said, actually, the federal party's application for summary dismissal is refused. There is reason to believe that they may have some at least vicarious liability here. They reversed the cost award, gave me back my money, and told the Alberta NDP, "Get your house in order. You have 30 days. Name and properly indemnify someone." So they finally did that, and this cost award is just on that. So this is solely on the question of who to name, and it it was kind of enhanced costs because the justice found that the parties, the federal and provincial NDP, but especially the provincial NDP, had engaged in litigation misconduct that needlessly delayed these proceedings. So we're now more than 4 years into these proceedings, and we've basically just figured out who to name on behalf of the Alberta NDP.
Wow, that is shocking behavior on the part of both the federal NDP branch and the provincial branch here in Alberta. I don't think my viewers will be too shocked to hear that. When you were told that you were going to have to pay $90,000 in costs to the federal NDP, I know you said that you think that they were hoping to do that so that you would simply be too discouraged to continue going. But at that point, did it register with you, maybe this is something that I can't continue with. I can't keep funding this legal case. I can't fund these costs. Or at that point where you like, this is now so high that I have no choice but to continue.
Yeah, and so to clarify, I was ordered to pay 45% of their full indemnity. So it ended up being about $45,000 in the end that I had to put up. Um, but again, the context here, I am the primary breadwinner for my 2 small children. I was rendered unemployable by this defamation. Like, no employer would consider looking at me. I was a reputational liability to anyone who associated with me. And I was fighting for a restraining order against one of the people involved who had continued sort of stalking and harassing me thereafter. I was now ordered to, so I'm like, just, the amount of stress was very significant, I think is an understatement. And then I felt essentially like I was tricked, very much seemed to me like the provincial party lied before an applications judge in order to frustrate these proceedings. And then I was being punished for having been tricked. And um, that's the point at which I think the last shred of my belief in a just world evaporated. And I thought, look, serious depression will do weird things to your perceptions, right? You end up with a very attenuated view of the future and you think things will never change. So that's the point at which I was like, there's no justice in this world. The best I can hope for is justice in the next. And nearly walked in front of a bus that night. I was just like, I'm done. There's nothing for me in this world. Um, so yeah, the impact was pretty devastating. And but this is what you go through, I think, as an individual litigant, going after much more deep-pocketed defendants who don't want to see this matter go to trial.
You said after that ruling came down, your last hope in a just world evaporated. Do you still feel that way today?
Um, for me, I think my understanding of hope is that it's not something to look for in this world in general. So, um, I think the hope for us human beings lies it's something that we can look to after this life in this world. It's just a kind of pilgrimage. Um, and so, like my philosophical disposition is we can certainly hope for justice in this world, but, you know, it's probably going to be frustrated in one way or another. So we should probably try to fix our eyes on eternity.
So you said that the Alberta NDP, this has been going on for 4 years now. They finally named the individual that you are able to go after for this defamation case. So what are the next steps? What is currently ongoing in this process?
Yeah, so they named their executive director, Garrett Spellacy, and we've started discovery with him. So we have a pretty tight timeline to try to conclude the discovery because this is the last piece of the puzzle. We have mediation with all of the parties. All of the defendants have requested mediation, so we have mediation scheduled for this spring. And like I said, we'll get a trial date later this month in December. So that will most likely be something like a 5-6 week trial in the first quarter of 2026 is what we're hoping for. So all told, this process, by the time we've gone through trial, it will have been nearly, well, goodness, it'll be like 7 years that this will have been ongoing. That's assuming no appeals, right?
With this case, specifically with the Alberta NDP, it's my understanding that you sued a number also of media outlets for defamation. I know that in some cases there's been settlement. So I think initially you said there was about 14 or 15 people who were named. What are the status of those other people that you named for defamation?
Yeah. So the kind of lead defendant was Kareem Jabraj, who initiated the defamation, and the media were, I think, due to some confirmation bias, perhaps all too eager to do away with their normal due diligence and listen to him and sort of collaborate with him. So he was noted in default years ago. He was found in contempt twice in this case and once in a collateral restraining order action. So he was found in contempt of court or cited in contempt 3 times, all told. And eventually his defense was struck. So he's in default. So basically, he's effectively, like in lay terms, guilty, and a cost apportionment will follow following the trial. And then Duncan Kinney and Progress Alberta, not to be confused with Press Progress, which remains in the lawsuit, they settled out. So Duncan Kinney is the executive director of Progress Alberta, which was a registered third-party advertiser during the 2019 election. So basically advertising on behalf of the NDP or against the UCP. They were also engaged, they kind of got involved publicly in defaming me about 10 days after the fact. Um, they went after Danielle Smith for having me on her radio show. So they launched a petition against her, threatened to target her advertisers for giving me a platform. And they've just settled out for $250,000. What was it? Maybe like 2 months ago now. So all of the other defendants, a few of them have made offers to settle, but those are still being negotiated. But I think we'll be going to trial against the major defendants, which would be the Alberta NDP, the CBC, Toronto Star, and the Broadbent Institute, which runs Press Progress.
You, as I mentioned in my opening statement, were like so viciously canceled. You've even just talked about some of the ways, organizations were going after podcasters simply for having you on their show, for giving you a platform, trying to get their advertisers canceled. It's such a textbook case of a vicious, vicious canceling. I feel like since 2019, the world has changed so much. And I don't know that what happened to you could happen in today's culture when we're so tired of the restrictions on our speech and people being canceled over really nothing. Do you think that what happened to you back in 2019 could happen today?
I'm sure that there are some people out there who have experienced something analogous more recently, but I think we've definitely the wave is probably crested, right? I think we're over the peak of the cancel culture sort of mass psychosis thing that was happening from 2018 to 2020 maybe, which is good, but I think it's valuable to recognize that these phenomena they did destroy lives. You have a number of instances of people who did actually end their lives, or who've been sort of permanently damaged in some way by what they went through, whether it's through post traumatic stress or severe depression or the breakdown of relationships. And and I think that there was a real cost socially, right? So it doesn't just affect those individuals. In my case, it affected all of my would-be constituents who were deprived of the opportunity to vote for the person whom they nominated to represent them in that election. But what happened to me was basically, a selective leak of excerpts of a private conversation that were deceptively edited and presented and so on. So it erodes the boundary between the public and private spheres. It undermines social trust when the media will just sort of go along with it. When, someone says, "I'm an informant, someone's committed a thought crime, ruin their lives for me." Um, it erodes social trust when you feel like you're always looking over your shoulder, wondering who's listening, who's going to inform on you to the state broadcaster or whatever. Where that's a credible fear, I don't think that's a healthy society. So it destroys trust and openness, which is the basis for social cooperation and social peace. It chills free inquiry again when you feel like you can't ask questions in good faith on matters of legitimate public interest for fear of being misrepresented somehow. It suffocates your ability to seek truth, and the whole cancel culture phenomenon really incentivized, a rush to judgment, a rush to outrage, the least charitable interpretations of strangers' motivations. It encourages people to see each other as enemies. So, like, these are incredibly socially corrosive things that cancel culture was playing on and that its proponents were playing on. And I think that there should be consequences for people who do that, right? Like the proponents again of these tactics always say there's no such thing as cancel culture. It's just consequence culture. Like, okay, so let's hold you accountable for what you've done. And, yes, it's going to be a very long process, but at least, you are going to have the benefit of of a fair sort of trial that I never got. But I think ultimately there does have to be accountability. And I like to think that by pursuing this case and seeing it through to the end, that it will disincentivize this kind of behavior in the future, that these actors will not be quite so cavalier before they ruin someone's life over, you know, an anonymous accusation.
Well, very well said, Caylan. Sounds like there's someone at their door. I know you have another meeting. I think in part the culture has changed due to people like you who are pushing back. So I thank you for that. And I know that we'll be following your case with interest.
Thanks so much, Rachel.
Okay, that was Caylan Ford updating us on her defamation suit. You guys are probably pretty familiar with her. I've had her on my old show, The Alberta Round, before to talk about the work that she is doing opening charter schools here in Alberta. So certainly a very interesting person, very academic. I really enjoy speaking with Caylan. Next, we are moving to our very own local celebrity, Alberta Director of the Canadian Taxpayer Federation, Kris Sims, is joining us today to discuss her legendary testimony at the Canadian Heritage Committee. I suspect some of you caught a few of those clips yesterday. Kris, thank you so much for being here today. I know you've been a regular on the show, but I feel like I'm in such awe of you today after that amazing performance at committee.
I imagined sometimes that you would have said really similar things as a longtime journalist who is opposed to government interference in journalism. So I was kind of channeling that whole thing while I was giving my presentation to the committee. And the Heritage Committee, of course, is examining whether or not we should defund the CBC or if we need a state broadcaster. They don't put it in quite those terms. But that's why at the Taxpayers Federation, I flew out and delivered that statement and then took questions. We actually went through 3 rounds of questions. Usually it's just 2 rounds. And by the time they went to round 3, I was like, uh-oh, do they have some explosive story? No, they didn't. They just said a lot of silly things like, well, I like listening to CBC Radio 1 in the morning. What do you mean we can't spend $1.4 billion on it? So I think it was generally well received, and it was good to be able to point out what a waste of money the CBC is, how few viewers they actually do have in reality, and also why it's wrong for journalists to be paid by the government.
Well, you certainly held your own and did a very good job. Did you feel like, I know you said you went through 3 rounds of questions, I feel like that would have been a little bit anxiety inducing. Did you feel like the questions were all reasonable and fair, or did you feel like it was a hostile environment? I know a few, I guess it was actually probably just last week or the week before, Lauren Southern was at a committee, a different committee, of course, when they were discussing foreign interference, and that was like so hostile to watch. Lauren Southern, obviously, very intelligent, was able to hold her own, similar to you yesterday. But it definitely felt like the Liberal MPs, they're really there. They've had their staff working on this for weeks, trying to come up with those gotcha questions. Typically, they felt fine. Did you feel like that yesterday? Did you feel like they were trying to get you, or did you feel like they were actually just trying to get information?
Definitely a hostile environment for sure. They don't like watching the Canadian Taxpayers Federation walk through those committee doors on a good day. As you've probably seen, my friend and colleague Franco Terrazzano, he's put the boots to them over and over again about things like their ridiculous spending, why they need to get that under control, why they need to balance the budget, all those sort of important topics. And also another colleague of mine, Devin Drover, at the same time on the same day was just down the hall from me arguing that we need to scrap the carbon tax. And so anytime, especially sitting politicians, see the Taxpayers Federation walk through the door, they aren't happy. But I don't care because they work for us, not the other way around. A backbench member of parliament, regardless of party, pulls in $200,000 a year with pretty much all of their expenses covered, including things like travel, paying their electricity bill, a lot of their food here in the national capital. So they're living pretty high on the hog. So I don't really care about their feelings. As far as the hostile questions go, the one that your audience might find funny is that they tried doing kind of a gotcha-ish question of, well, you do interviews on True North. It's like, yeah, we know. They're posted on the internet. Like, this isn't a secret. And he's like, well, how can you do that if you want responsible journalism? And I hope you guys do eventually have the clip. I think I said, we have responsible journalists everywhere, including True North, Western Standard, Rebel. And there are some responsible journalists still left over in our old stomping ground, Rachel, in the mainstream media. The point is they shouldn't take money from the government, and you should be able to trust what they say. We also brought up the fact that isn't raised very often is that trust in media has plummeted here in Canada. Around 62% of Canadians now believe that journalists are actively trying to mislead them with statements they know to be false. It's brutal. And we think one of the big reasons for that is because, of course, we have the CBC, which is state journalism, that is government-funded journalism. And we also have so many on the mainstream media now that are also on government payroll. That has got to affect people's trust in journalism.
Can't believe that you do interviews with those horrible racists over here at True North, Kris. What do you think, Nate?
It was so funny. It's just like, we know our faces out there on the internet, right? So yeah, it was really weird. It was definitely kind of a cancel-y thing, but the question was so poorly worded that it didn't really matter.
It was actually funny. I just had Caylan Ford on the show
Ooh.
ahead of you, and obviously she is fighting back on her infamous canceling of 2019 very effectively, I think. And Caylan and I were just talking about, I don't really think that, the world is accepting, Canada culture is accepting of these sort of cancellations anymore. I think that we've really kind of passed that, and people just don't have the time or energy for it. Everyone seems to kind of understand that, except for, I would assume, Liberal MPs. We do have a couple clips of your committee testimony. Here is one of you going scorched earth on the CBC. Take a look at this.
We are here to speak for thousands of hardworking taxpayers who want to defund the CBC. This needs to happen for 3 important reasons: the cost of the CBC, nearly nobody is watching the CBC, and journalists should not be paid by the government. First, the cost. The CBC is getting $1.4 billion from taxpayers this year. That money could instead pay the salaries of around 7,000 paramedics and 7,000 police officers. That money could instead pay for groceries for about 85,000 Canadian families for a year. Instead, taxpayers are paying $1.4 billion so the CBC can hand out huge bonuses, get microscopic ratings, and overpay its out-of-touch executives. CBC CEO Catherine Tate refused to tell this committee if she will take a severance when she leaves the state broadcaster. Tate considers that to be a personal matter, and quote, "It's not personal if it's taxpayers' money."
Wow, amazing, amazing. So well said. I have to ask, you really laid into the fact a few times during your committee testimony that like no one's watching the CBC. You just described it in the clip as a microscopic audience. How did the committee handle receiving that news?
I think a lot of them, so I'm not trying to be ageist, but a lot of them are a bit older than us. So they're still kind of stuck in this mentality of, oh, well, we have 4 channels on our bunny eared television, and that's what you tune into for the news. That has changed so much that so here at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we filed an FOI and we obtained documents showing the supper hour news ratings. And legitimately, I had to recheck them and talk about it with our team. They're so small, Rachel. So let's start in the East, just to be fair. In Toronto, their audience, like how many people on average are watching the 6 o'clock supper hour local news? It was around 48,000 people. That may seem like a lot of people, but for the population of Toronto, that is 0.7%. Like, it is an astonishingly low number, and that's for Toronto, okay? Calgary, you have to get, like, a telescope to look at this. It is 0.2% of the population of Calgary are tuning into their CBC 6 o'clock supper hour news. So, if the CBC takes in $1.4 billion from taxpayers in the year and nearly nobody is watching it, is it still a waste of money? Yeah, it sure as heck is. Why are we doing this?
Yeah, those numbers are shockingly low. True North pulls similar numbers on our video podcast at times, and I can tell you that we certainly do not have access to the same resources as CBC News.
No,
So
just to put a pin on, like it's such amount of money. Like Catherine Tate is paid so much money, so roughly $500,000, give or take Canadian. Because anybody who's following her, she is CEO level 7. Okay, if you know what that means as far as the grid goes for federal bureaucrat payment for Crown Corporation, and you're trying to track her down, she's level 7, folks. We have that from the CBC itself. $500,000. That is more than the president of the United States is paid. Like, that's crazy pants. There's no way that some bureaucrat of a state broadcaster should be paid that kind of money.
well, I'm certainly glad that we have you guys to dig into this. I have to ask, I know you often kind of, you don't want to wade too much into your personal opinion, but with Catherine Tate and her not telling the committee whether she'll take a severance when she leaves, like, is this someone who is just in it for the money? Because that's certainly how it strikes me.
So, what I would say is all of her performances at this committee have definitely bolstered the case to defund the CBC. And it's not just because of the numbers, although the numbers are appalling. It's the attitude. It is just rolling off of her of being entitled to entitlements. Like, for example, she was saying things, again, I'm paraphrasing in one of her more recent committee appearances, things like, oh, well, the people of Canada would be upset if the president of the CBC was not at the opening ceremonies for the Olympic Games. It's like, what? Really? She even said something like, if not for the CBC, the language Inuktitut would not exist in Canada. That is so weird because quite often the CBC will try to hide behind this idea that, oh, well, what about Indigenous programming? You need us for Indigenous programming, don't you? Well, actually, if you look at the numbers that were dug up by Blacklock's Reporter, which is an outstanding journalism organization that does not take money from the government, they're spending more money, Rachel, like more than twice as much on their executive bonuses than they do on Indigenous programming. APTN, which is run out of Winnipeg, which takes a tiny fraction of taxpayers' money for like a one event per year. All the rest is privately funded. They do way better for Indigenous programming. And last I checked, I think they broadcast in like 12 separate Indigenous languages. So they do not need the CBC from Toronto to come in and save Indigenous culture. That just gets my hair standing on end.
One of the things that you did at the committee testimony that I really appreciated is you kept reminding the committee and the MPs that it was taxpayers' money. They would be like, well, federal subsidies, and you're like, no, this is money paid by the Canadian taxpayer, by people like you and me and all of you watching at home. You are going to work every day. You're waking up at 6 a.m., driving to work in the dark on the snowy, icy roads so that Catherine Tate can go to the Olympics opening ceremony, and she she thinks that you'll be upset if she's not there. I can tell you for a fact, no one cares, Catherine Tate. You are so out of touch. You were just as out of touch as Chrystia Freeland, who said this week that Canadian mothers are grateful that we can now afford rotisserie chickens at the grocery store because those prepared meals really make all that much of a difference. Let me tell you, the nights that you're eating a rotisserie chicken at home, you're not celebrating like how you're like, oh, sorry guys, didn't really have time for dinner today. Sorry that this meal is so lame and crap. Like, it's so out of touch, so ridiculous. These people have no idea what they're talking about.
And
So I just go ahead.
the idea of the GST off of it, which is fine. I'll take a tax cut any day. That's fine, even if they screw it up. And frankly, only the Trudeau government could screw up a tax cut in this spectacular a fashion. Like, that was kind of amazing.
Because they don't know how to give them. They don't know how to give tax cuts.
It's amazing. They kind of own the podium on that, eh? But that was so insulting for her to say that, Chrystia Freeland to say that, because one, she can't balance the budget. Like, she has no idea. She even said we're in a, what is it? We're a vibe session.
Yeah, Canadians are not actually your pocketbooks aren't hurting. It's just for some reason you don't get that the economy is good, you guys. This is the best economy ever. I don't know why you guys at home aren't understanding that. Canadians just don't seem to be getting it. So she said it's a vibe session because Canadians, we have the greatest economy of all time, but Canadians, they're just feeling down about it for some reason.
Which is super embarrassing because she's a finance minister of a G7 country. She's not a friend of yours that you're gossiping with over coffee at the mall. And she said, we're in a vibe session. So silly. But to the point on the roast chicken, when she actually said this is a gift to mothers around Christmas. Okay, number one, the GST on a roast chicken with seasoning roughly will cost you around 45 cents, 50 cents, depending on what you're getting it for. And for her to say that while she's a cabinet minister pulling in $300,000 per year with most of her expenses covered, like, they're just not getting it.
Saying to mothers that receiving the ability to pay for rotisserie chicken is like a Christmas gift would be like your husband or your family buying you like cookingware for Christmas. It's like, do you know that like I have value is like more than someone who prepares food for you? Like it's so like it's like the worst thing that you could receive. Okay, some of you at home are like, oh, I like getting cook. Most women do not want cookware for Christmas. We make a lot of food for our family. We want something that we're going to enjoy, like nice jewelry or like a massage. Do not get your wives and mothers for cookware unless they've specifically asked for it. That's what that type of gift feels like to me.
Yes, it should be a treat for sure.
Yes. So moving back to the committee testimony, I wanted to play my favorite moment when you were asked about CBC being the keeper of Canadian culture. Take a look.
So for those that would say, well, it's required for Canadian culture, for the preservation of Canadian culture, how would you respond to that?
I find that odd because there's a lot of private media companies and there's a lot of other forms of entertainment and news that Canadians are choosing to watch and to listen to and to share. And the idea that a government-funded broadcaster is going to be the keeper of Canadian culture is kind of insulting to people's intelligence and their own choice. If I don't watch the CBC, does that mean that I'm not Canadian? That's absurd. So no, Canadians are choosing to not watch the CBC. So ergo, we don't need it,
30
and
seconds.
we should defund it.
So good, so legendary. If I don't watch the CBC, does that mean I'm not Canadian? No, that's absurd. That should be like a quote written on everyone's walls. What was the reaction in the room when you said this?
The Conservatives liked it. The NDP got uncomfortable because they actually, I may disagree with a lot of their policies, but they do kind of have firm principles on stuff, whereas the Liberals were just like, uh-oh. Why did she say that? And this, again, leads back to my opening point off the top of the interview, is that I think a lot of times there's this kind of holdover of like, welcome everybody to Hockey Night in Canada. You've only got 3 channels to pick from and we're it. You have to tune into the CBC for the weather report or the hockey news or to find out what's going on. And I think it's this strange holdover of like, well, without the CBC, who would have delivered you Mr. Dress Up? Or, where would have Peter Zosky worked, right? Going back to some of, the older programming that was on the CBC. And that's all fine and good. We're not saying that you need to take all of the archives of the CBC and throw them into an incinerator. Put them at the National Archives so people can access them. Further, the CBC, independent of taxpayers' money, generates around $400 to $500 million-ish per year. That's nothing to sneeze at. They could still do their little radio thing. They could still have a big digital archive if they manage their money well and they don't blow it on bonuses and overpaying their executives. And so for them to say, oh, well, what would happen to Canadian culture? That is such a self-centered attitude. Again, we have lots of people in Canada, obviously the majority of them, who are not watching the CBC anymore. Are we going to revoke their citizenship? That was super weird.
Yeah, very well put. And I especially liked your point that Canadians, we will pay for the content that we want to watch. Most of us have Netflix subscriptions. Some of you might even be able to afford Disney Plus now, that we have this amazing tax break from the Liberal government. I think you can start that again. Prime Video, a lot of people pay for the content that they like, and I think that will continue. So, Kris, thank you for being here today. I just feel so honored to be in the presence of such a celebrity as yourself. I know
No, you honestly would have said very similar things. I was kind of channeling you and Sheila and a lot of different independent journalists there and trying to speak up for us.
Well, I feel like I was very well represented at that committee yesterday, so thank you very much. I know my audience will appreciate it as well.
Thank you.
Okay, guys, and now I have to turn to the comment section because I have been embroiled in a very significant controversy. And, I've taken a few weeks to think about it, and I think that it's finally time that I address it. So, this is something that I have been seeing, I believe, from the same person under a number of my videos, a comment that has been left under a number of my videos on YouTube. And I received a lengthy email about it the other day. So I'm going to address this controversy right now for the very first time on the Rachel Parker Show. Mrs. Parker, please, please, please explain to me why you do not use the word woman and consistently replace the word woman with the word woman when you talk. Both Megan Murphy and Linda Blade used both the word woman and the word woman throughout your interview with them, using, as I and most people do, woman for singular and woman for plural. Meanwhile, as you always do, you used only the woman even when you were referring to multiple women or two women in general. You use only the word woman for both singular and plural. You presumably have a reason for this. Please, please, please explain to me why you refuse to use the word woman. I have asked you this question several times over the last year or so. Please answer me. I really would like to know what your reason is, please. Thank you. Now, it's true. I have seen this comment left under my videos before, and after giving it significant thought, I have to admit, I think the reason is simply that I do not enunciate my words enough. This is not something that I was doing intentionally, and I apologize that it has caused at least one of you such distress. So in the future, I will do my best to enunciate the word woman and woman so you can clearly hear the distinctions between the two words. I have a tendency to speak rather quickly, and perhaps that is why my enunciation is not exactly as specific as some of you would like it to be. But alas, there are always improvements that we can all make. So I hope that I have finally addressed this controversy once and for all. Okay, everyone, that's all we have time for on today's show. I should also mention I ran into one of you guys when I was out shopping in Central Alberta this week, and you said you always tell us to leave comments. I don't know where to leave the comments. I know that some of you guys watch the video on the True North website. You actually have to click on the video with the part where it takes you to YouTube. And if you want to leave a comment, please do so on YouTube, because that is typically where I look through the comment section as well. I sometimes check the comments on X, but most of you leave the comments on YouTube. That is where I look for them. So if you've been wondering where to leave those comments, do it on YouTube. Okay, everyone, that's all we have time for today. I will see you guys all next week or tomorrow on Rachel and the Republic. If you want to tune in for that, I hope that you guys have a great rest of your week. God bless.